Welcome to 8th grade Social Studies STAR Test Prep. Today's topic in the 7-Minute Mastery Series is Reconstruction. All right, the Civil War essentially comes to an end at Appomattox Courthouse. This is where General Robert E. Lee surrenders his Confederate Army to Ulysses S. Grant and the Union Army. This is April 9th, 1865. There's some more things that need to follow this, but this is essentially when the war ends, okay? Only 5 days after this, however, President Abraham Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. This proved to be a terrible blow to Confederate states, ironically, as Lincoln wanted a lenient re-entry for the rebellious states. Those that followed felt a little bit differently than Lincoln. Lincoln really wanted to unite the nation. Yes, he was against slavery, but more than anything, his goal was to unite the nation. Those in Congress after him, known as radical Republicans, their view was a little bit different. So let's talk about those radical Republicans. They're strong abolitionists, meaning those who fought and wanted no more slavery. They wanted to abolish it. Well, they fought for civil rights for former slaves. They felt the southern states deserved harsh treatment for their role in slavery and the war. So radical Republicans really were progressive in that they wanted a lot of opportunities and civil rights and voting power and a lot of things for former slaves. But their goal wasn't so much the uniting of the nation. Their goal was the freedmen's opportunities. So let's talk about Reconstruction. And usually, historically, we see Reconstruction split into two parts, okay? You have the presidential Reconstruction. So after Lincoln's assassinated, as we know, Vice President Andrew Johnson becomes president. Well, he is actually a former Southerner. He's from Tennessee. And so as a Southerner, he is really sympathetic to the Confederate States. He really is a Southerner himself. So he is really resisted by these radical Republicans because Andrew Johnson wants the country to be united, and he wants a really lenient view on former slaveholders. He just wants to say, okay, all is forgiven and forgotten. And he also begins to give land back to former slaveholders who originally was promised to slaves. That never panned out. So as he's resisted, let's kind of talk about this. We end up going into the Congressional Reconstruction, which is where Congress kind of takes over and overrides much of Andrew Johnson's work. So these radical Republicans in Congress, as we know, they're very progressive. They want rights and liberties and privileges and opportunities for these former slaves, these African Americans. Well, they begin to overrule Johnson. Johnson vetoes some of the congressional civil rights movements. And when he vetoes them, it gets sent back to Congress. This is government in action here. And Congress actually gets a 2/3 majority vote, which is unheard of to this point. And they override his veto. So civil rights movements begin to be made into law. Well, during this time, the radical Republicans split the South into 5 military districts. They say these 5 separate districts are going to be monitored, watched, and regulated by Union or United States forces. Military forces are in the South, making sure these former Confederate states are doing what they're told, basically. They require these states, if they want to rejoin the Union, they have to ratify or agree to sign off on the 14th Amendment, which is equal protection to these former slaves, among other things. So under this radical Reconstructions, blacks actually voted. Many of them held office. We even had a black governor. So it looks like things are starting to turn and that the African Americans are starting to play a role as citizens in this country. Let's talk about some of these Reconstruction amendments. You have the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery in the United States. So I want you to memorize these 3. It may be hard to do, but we need to memorize these 3 amendments for sure. 13th Amendment abolished or outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., and this is the part we need to remember. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection under the laws, no matter who you were. The 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote. So this right to vote in the law, it said, shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. So it says, even if you are an African American, if you have darker skin, if you were actually a slave, it doesn't matter. You can now have the opportunity to vote. Now, let's be clear. This didn't apply to women. That opportunity to vote was many years away still. Many southern states had laws to restrict blacks' ability to vote, however. They tried to kind of work their way around this amendment. They instituted things like literacy tests and poll taxes. Basically, there were kind of legal loopholes that they made African Americans jump through in order to vote, making it very difficult for these African Americans, these former slaves, to actually finally really vote in the South. All right, speaking of these obstacles, let's talk about what some of them were. So in the South, immediately after the Civil War, something that was eventually called black codes began to take place. They were overtly racist and restrictive laws against former slaves imposed within many former Confederate states, so Southern states, right after the Civil War. Blacks were restricted oftentimes to work in only specific jobs. They had to sign annual labor contracts, were paid little to nothing, were often legally forced into labor in very similar manner to slavery, and were restricted from going in all kinds of different places and participating in liberties that other whites in the South had. These were called black codes. They were very racist, restrictive laws, as I said. Well, you also have the Freedmen's Bureau that pushed against these kind of things. The Freedmen's Bureau was a federal government organization formed right after the Civil War, and they worked to provide food, shelter, clothing, schools, employment opportunities, and organized social structure for former slaves. So the Freedmen's Bureau was a national bureau to help former slaves, while Black Codes was a terrible set of laws throughout the southern states restricting black rights. All right, let's get to some questions. As always, press pause after I say the question. You find your answer, then press play and find out if you're right. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. The measures in this list are examples of ways southern states weaken the effects of, press pause, here's your answer, the 15th Amendment. Freedmen's Bureau provided food, shelter, clothing, negotiated and enforced labor contracts, and blank. Which of the following best completes this list? Press pause. Here's your answer. They established schools. That was one of many things the Freedmen's Bureau did. Establishment of South's first state-funded public school system, implementation of more equitable taxation system, prohibition of racial discrimination on public transportation and accommodations. These reforms were instituted by, press pause, here's your answer, Reconstruction governments after the Civil War. Many historians argue that the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln changed the course of Reconstruction. Which of the following is usually cited as an aspect of that change? Here's your answer. Radical Republicans took control of Congress. A historian is writing an article for a history website. The article is divided into the following topics: division of South into military districts, the impeachment of a president, ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Which era in U.S. history is the focus of this article? I think we know this one, I hope. Reconstruction era. All right. Thanks for watching today. And that's all.